Classic albums can typically be divided into two categories. Some are just simply collections of great songs with nothing in particular tying them together thematically or sonically. Others are in fact cohesive works of art, best experienced as a whole from beginning to end, while also, of course, being a collection of great songs too. Pet Sounds, the Beach Boys' 11th landmark studio album, most definitely falls into the latter category. That Pet Sounds was such a cohesive collection of songs was, like everything else Brian Wilson meticulously worked on, no accident. It was a combination of Wilson's growing maturity as a composer, the organic direction in which his writing was going, and an artistic competition with a certain songwriting duo from Liverpool, England. In fact, it was the Beatles' sixth studio album Rubber Soul, released in late 1965, that served as Wilson's motivation and creative catalyst to make what would become Pet Sounds. Saying in the Beatles' Stories documentary, quote, "Rubber Soul just took me away, and I went to the piano and started writing Pet Sounds. It took me to Pet Sounds." What he admired about the album, aside from the brilliant songwriting, was how the album carried the same consistent tonal quality throughout. The Beatles were still wearing their folk influences from artists like Bob Dylan heavily on their sleeves, while simultaneously maturing their pop and rock orientated compositional techniques and experimenting with new instruments and new musical ideas. With their new creative freedom, a much longer allotted time to record the LP, 4 weeks, a significant amount of time by the standards of the day, and the increasingly slick production of George Martin, meant that the soul-inspired Drive My Car, the folky sitar-infused Norwegian Wood, fuzz bass-laden hard rocker Think For Yourself, and the touching ballad In My Life, complete with harpsichord solo, all worked as a whole, making it the most expansive and progressive Beatles album up to that point, while also managing to retain the same sonic aesthetic throughout. Brian Wilson immediately took note, remarking that Rubber Soul went together like no album ever made before. To put these words into context, you have to remember that this was an era where albums were released systematically in quick succession to capitalise on an artist's popularity. Bands were seen as a commodity, to be cashed in upon and then discarded once interest in them had waned. Very few groups had any real longevity, therefore albums were often a rushed collection of covers and deep cuts of mixed quality, all of which were usually just used as a vehicle to promote the band's singles, which were oftentimes the only truly great songs on the album. It should also be noted that prior to the release of Rubber Soul, both the Beatles and the Beach Boys were just as guilty of this as anyone else. However, soul was an anomaly in this musical climate, setting a new and unprecedented standard for what an album could be and, in fact, should be. And Wilson, now truly inspired, was determined to follow suit. While the Beatles undoubtedly beat the Beach Boys in releasing an album of this ilk, they most certainly were not the only group writing more mature, elaborate songs up to this point. In fact, while the Beatles wrote love songs exclusively on every album and single they released up until Rubber Soul, while also displaying flourishes of what was to come musically, the Beach Boys had released songs that were more obvious precursors to the lyrical introspection and compositional maturity that will be fully explored on Pet Sounds. The intro to California Girls, which appeared on their 1965 album Summer Days and Summer Nights, is like a proto Wouldn't It Be Nice, with its plucked, melodic, echoey guitar riff underpinned by a horn arrangement, an early indicator of Brian Wilson's desire to utilise atypical instrumentation in the context of a rock and roll song. Even as early as 1963, a song like In My Room, sophisticated in arrangement and melancholic in tone, was a lyrical glimpse into the introverted mind of Wilson and his penchant towards self-isolation, something which is thematically prevalent throughout Pet Sounds. Recording sessions for Pet Sounds began in January of 1966 and lasted roughly 3 months. By this point, Wilson had ceased touring with the Beach Boys altogether, much like the Beatles did around this time also. This allowed him to focus entirely on composing while the rest of the group went out and played shows. He also brought in jingle writer Tony Asher, known at the time for penning jingles for the likes of Mattel Toys and Gallo Wines, to collaborate with him on the album. Asher's impact on the record is undeniable, and although most of his contributions were lyrical rather than musical, he he still co-wrote 8 of the 13 songs on the album, with one of the remaining 5, Sloop John B, being a traditional song, rearranged for the album but not written by Wilson. As much of a musical genius as Wilson was, very few people would laud the lyrical prowess of either himself or any of the other Beach Boys. During writing sessions, Asher would have deep conversations with Wilson about life and the mind of the songwriter. In essence, Asher was used as a conduit to take Wilson's thoughts and emotions and condense them into neater, more palatable prose across Pet Sounds' verses and choruses. When asked by Rolling Stone magazine about his contribution to the record, Asher said the following: "It's fair to say that the general tenor of the lyrics was always his, and the actual choice of words was usually mine. I was really just his interpreter." Reflecting on the lyrics on Pet Sounds and the Wilson-Asher partnership, Dennis Wilson said, "He was able to organise his thoughts to a point where they were hypnotic, yet entertaining and meaning and spiritual." Conversely, the remaining members of the Beach Boys, who were touring during writing sessions for the album, are almost entirely absent from it instrumentally. The only tracks to feature the other members of the band playing their instruments are on That's Not Me and God Only Knows, with Dennis Wilson drumming on the former and Carl Wilson playing guitar on both. The band of course sing on all the tracks, but even here Brian takes lead vocal duties on more numbers than any other Beach Boy. He sings 5 by himself, shares joint vocal duties with Mike Love on Sloop John B, and features as a backup vocalist on 3 other tracks. Speaking of Love, he also took a major backseat in the creative department. While it is undeniable that Wilson was the primary creative force behind the Beach Boys' music, Love collaborated with him on many songs on previous albums, providing mostly lyrical contributions. Now, many people have stated that Love was unhappy with the direction Wilson was taking on Pet Sounds, something which he categorically denies to this day, with the exception of the title to one song, which we will look at later. Either way, it would appear that Asher took Love's job as wordsmith and Wilson's right-hand man on Pet Sounds. The brunt of the music was played by the Sid Sharp Strings Group, who provided the cello and violin parts heard throughout the album, and a massive group of 42 musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. Essentially an all-star collection of session musicians based in Los Angeles, the exceptionally talented group, comprised mostly of performers with backgrounds in classical or jazz music, came together in the late 1950s and were hired by a who's who of popular music artists in the 60s and 70s, including Dean Martin, The Byrds, Mamas and the Papas, Ike and Tina Turner, Simon and Garfunkel, Frank and Nancy Sinatra, Neil Diamond, and many, many more. The group provided instrumental variation, which distinguished Pet Sounds from other albums in the popular music spectrum, colouring the album with a wide array of stringed, wood, brass, and percussive instruments, including some atypical instruments which would define the sound of some of the album's tracks, such as a brass harmonica, played by Tommy Morgan, which actually plays a solo on I Know There's an Answer, the bicycle bells and other unusual percussive devices heard throughout You Still Believe in Me, and, perhaps most famously, the theremin played by Paul Tanner on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, an instrument which would be famously utilised again a few months later to great effect on their smash hit and, in the eyes of many, Brian Wilson's magnum opus, Good Vibrations. All in all, more than 60 musicians performed across the entire album, and that number doesn't even include the Beach Boys themselves, which now included Bruce Johnson, who started out as a touring musician for the band, but provides vocals on the album. From laying down the initial backing tracks on July 12, 1965, to the final session on April 13, 1966, Pet Sounds took 9 months and over $70,000, which is roughly $500,000 today, to record. The cost, time, and personnel, should be noted Brian brought in about half a dozen engineers along with his army of musicians, incurred to create Pet Sounds was absolutely extravagant and unheard of for the time. However, when you consider the compositional and textural complexity of the album, listening back even now, it's hard to argue that the expense wasn't justified, because Pet Sounds still sounds as fresh, vital, and brilliant over half a century later as it did back then. Thematically, the album deals with love, faithfulness, heartbreak, and alienation. something which is not hard to decipher for the average fan who has listened to it repeatedly over time. However, it only occurred to me upon going through the album analytically, track by track, how the album shifts from optimistic devotion to bitter, lonely cynicism as it progresses. So much so, in fact, that the album can almost be split down the middle from side A to side B between these two conflicting emotions. For example, on side 1, Brian sings about picking up the pieces of a girl who's had her heart broken by another man on I'm Waiting for the Day, wishing to fulfill the role of carer and saviour, singing, I gave you love with a brand new start. He hurt you then, but that's all gone. I'm waiting for the day when you can love again. But on side 2's Here Today, Brian has become totally gun-shy of blind love and cautioning the lover of one of his exes that while a brand new love affair is such a beautiful thing, he must think about the pain it could bring, and goes on to list all the symptoms of heartbreak before a chorus detailing how fleeting and temporary love is. It's almost like Brian ages as the album unfolds, track by track. But going back to young love, optimism and longingness, let's look at the album's opening track, and one of the best songs on Pet Sounds. Wouldn't It Be Nice opens up with beautifully reverberating broken guitar chords plucked by Jerry Cole, before a snare crash introduces the full ensemble of musicians and the eponymous lead lyric sung by Brian himself. Within the first 30 seconds of the opening track, many of the musical elements that would shape and define the rest of the album are introduced. The previously mentioned reverb is prevalent throughout the album, particularly noticeable in the guitars and percussive instruments, and gives the album a uniquely haunting atmosphere, which lends beautifully to the mood and the subject matter of the lyrics. In the first verse, the wall of sound which Wilson developed while writing and recording the album is introduced, driven primarily by not one but two accordion players in sync together, going through the song's chord progressions and rhythmic flow. Also by a walking bass, which is played by Carol Kay and is extremely prevalent throughout Pet Sounds, underpinning many of the album's songs to great effect. This highlights Wilson's understanding of jazz and classical music, while also serving as a reminder that Wilson was, in fact, the Beach Boys bass player. Speaking on the instrumentation of Wouldn't It Be Nice, Wilson said, "Listen for the rocking accordions and the ethereal guitars in the introduction. Tony and I had visualised a scene. We had a feeling in our hearts, like a vibration. We put it into music and it found its way onto tape. We really felt good about that record." The chorus showcases Brian's penchant and talent for dynamic shifts, with the pace of the song slowing to halftime and the low drone of the saxophones underpinning his words. The chorus also features the first instance of the band's signature harmony and polyphony. Aside from the introduction of things that would feature throughout the rest of the album, Wouldn't It Be Nice also serves in many ways as a microcosm for what Pet Sounds ultimately is. A vast array of complex musical arrangements, textures, harmonies, polyphony, and introspective lyrics, homogenized tonally in the studio for the sake of cohesion, but still sounding absolutely brilliant. Of course, as with everything Wilson did in the studio, none of this was a happy accident. Speaking of Wilson's perfectionism and the grueling recording sessions for the track, Bruce Johnson had this to say: "As big as California Girls was, Brian was unhappy with our rhythm of singing, and with that of a high standard to get it right, Wouldn't It Be Nice required a lot of perfect vocal rhythm. We re-recorded it at least 4 times. He also did things like having brother Dennis sing while cupping his mouth with his hands, an esoteric method to take the sound he heard in his head and put it on wax. Wouldn't It Be Nice isn't a classic track solely due to the complexities of the songwriting and the variety of its musical textures. It's a classic because these parts make up the whole of a wonderfully crafted pop song, albeit within the context of Pet Sounds' elaborate musicality. Coinciding with the theme of romantic optimism heard on I'm Waiting for the Day are 2 side 1 love ballads in the form of You Still Believe in Me and Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder. While Wouldn't It Be Nice is carried along by a percussive assault that drives the track for the majority of its duration, both these songs, much slower in tempo, are guided gently along by cymbal touches every bar, and only a mere finger cymbal on Don't Talk. Whereas Wouldn't It Be Nice goes through a litany of changes melodically and rhythmically, both these tracks have 1 or 2 main melodic motifs that are established early and are repeated throughout. Also, the vocals come to the forefront on both of these tracks more so than on any other, and are used to establish the melody of the songs. On You Still Believe in Me, the instrumentation mimics the vocal line, with the piano directly shadowing it in the introduction. In the verses, there is a quasi-call and response interplay between Wilson's vocals, about a woman sticking through their love affair in spite of the protagonist's self-doubt and lack of attentiveness, and the harpsichord. The strings do a similar thing with his vocals in the chorus of Don't Talk. I would say arrangement-wise, these two tracks are the most simplistic on the album, along with side 2's eponymous instrumental, which has a distinct guitar riff that carries the entire song. I also think that while they're nicely arranged compositions and good songs overall, check out the outro vocal harmony and polyphony in Still Believe, and the solo violin-cello interlude of Don't Talk for evidence of this. They are probably the 3 weakest songs on the album, at least in my opinion. Now don't get me wrong, these 3 songs are good. Don't Talk in particular is a beautiful tune and the stronger of the 3, and there are definitely going to be people in the comment section who think 1 or 3 of these songs are some of the best cuts on Pet Sounds, which is fair enough and a testament to the overall quality of the album. This is just one man's opinion. These tracks also carry forward the themes of youthful love and affection. Despite what I think, Wilson was fond of Don't Talk, particularly the closing line of the song's chorus, "Listen to my heartbeat." He was quoted as saying, "I felt very deeply about that line. One of the sweetest songs I ever sang. I have to say I'm proud of it. The innocence of youth in my voice, of being very young and childlike. I think that's what people liked." What's interesting is that I ranked the songs on the album from worst to best, my own preference of course, before I did an in-depth analysis of them. I didn't rank them to support any argument, and it's only now that I'm considering why I rated all the other songs on the album more highly. I guess it comes back to tracks like Wouldn't It Be Nice being made so great and so special by the complex arrangements and the wall of noise soundscape as a means of creating them. And while I don't believe that you need musical virtuosity or songwriting complexity to make a song great, some of the best pop songs are very simplistic. I wonder if these tracks feel less than simply when compared to the magnitude of the musical tapestries that surround them. Sandwiched between Don't Talk and You Still Believe in Me is a track that doesn't receive a lot of recognition, but one which I think is highly underrated and one of the best songs in the entire record. That's Not Me. While every song discussed thus far has been about a love interest, That's Not Me is the first personally introspective track on the album, with the narrator focusing on himself and his own life. In fact, Wilson stated that the song reveals a lot about who he is, as he and Asher tackle the sometimes painful task of self-analysis. Although Asher said in an interview that the writing process for That's Not Me was laboured, and he felt that he had missed the mark lyrically, I feel that the lyrics here are some of the strongest on the album. Lacking the poetic grace of Wouldn't It Be Nice or Don't Talk, That's Not Me is much more blunt and autobiographical in nature. One of 3 songs in this style, and we'll look at the other 2, which are found on side 2, a little later. Mike Love matter-of-factly runs off lines in the verses like, "I had to prove that I could make it alone," or "I wanted to show how independent I'd grown," and "I went through all kinds of changes, took a look at myself," all ending in the refrain of, "That's not me." Speaking of Love's vocal delivery, Wilson was complimentary of them on this track, quoted in the Pet Sounds Sessions liner notes as saying, "He just really nailed it. Real powerful voice. A very souped up kind of sound." Speaking of the song's lyrics, Wilson stated that, quote, "The song reveals a lot about myself. Just the idea that you're going to look at yourself and say, hey, now look, that's not me. Kind of square off with yourself and say, this is me, that's not me." A nice way of summing up Pet Sounds' more straightforward lyrical moment, and one of its finest. Complementing the blunter, more matter-of-fact wordplay is one of the most stripped-down musical backing tracks of the whole album, easing back on the elaborate classically inspired structures heard thus far, for something more akin to a straight-up rock and roll song. However, unlike the last 2 songs we discussed, its more simplistic nature acts as more of a strength than an impediment. The first song only to feature the Beach Boys instrumentally, a few additional percussionists adding decoration notwithstanding. We have Dennis on drums, Carl on both lead and rhythm guitars, and Brian on bass guitar and Hammond organ, playing single notes which drone underneath the guitar licks. Minimalist when compared to the rest of the album. Nonetheless, the varied percussive elements of the tambourines and woodblocks that accompany Dennis's rock drumming, along with the organ and guitars, all doused generously in that signature reverb, mean that in spite of its more straightforward structure, it retains the atmosphere of the album as well as any of its other songs. This is never more obvious than in the song's outro, which sees the whole band joining together for a coda, with Mike Love repeating half of the chorus, singing, "I once had a dream, so I packed up and split for the city. I soon found out that my lonely life wasn't so pretty," over and over again while he and the band gradually fade out, which, for me, is the best ending to a song on the whole album, except maybe for God Only Knows. After the stripped down arrangement of That's Not Me and the mellow balladry of Don't Talk, we pick up sonically where Wouldn't It Be Nice left off with another up-tempo wall of noise in the form of I'm Waiting for the Day. Now, we've spoken already about this track's lyrics earlier on, which, along with Nice, earned Love his second co-writing credit on side 1, so we won't talk about them again here. Carl Wilson has been quoted as saying that this song is perhaps one of the most dynamic moments in the album, and it's hard to argue with his assessment. Beginning with a booming timpani intro, which is soon accompanied by the drums in polyrhythm and then filled out by a marching band-esque woodwind melody in one of the album's loudest moments. All of this suddenly gives way to the first verse, which is one of the album's quietest moments, with Wilson's vocal melody being shadowed note for note by a single viola, with block chords on the Hammond organ and a very clever ukulele line appearing in counterpoint at the end of every vocal line. The chorus is almost just as tranquil, but builds to a second verse which harkens back to the bombast of the intro. This track is a textbook example of the complexities in dynamics, instrumentation, and melody featured on the album as a whole. All of which is, of course, wrapped up neatly in a great pop song. Earlier in the video I mentioned how the side 2 instrumental Pet Sounds, while far from bad, was one of the comparatively weaker moments on the album. Well, the same cannot be said about the side 1 instrumental Let's Go Away for a While, which, like That's Not Me, is one of the most overlooked moments on Pet Sounds, and is just an absolutely beautiful piece of music. In fact, Wilson said that this was the finest piece of art he had ever made, at least up until that point, taking inspiration from both classical music genius Beethoven and Burt Bacharach, a prolific pop songwriter in the 1950s and 60s. The song is based around 3 distinct melodic sections, which are enhanced by the vast musical roster, adding little flourishes throughout. The first 2 sections are led by 2 different themes played on the vibraphone, both of which have a serene, dreamlike quality. The first theme is an ascending-descending riff on the lower end of the vibraphone's tonal range. After the first theme is run through once, it is played again but is complemented by a beautiful swell of strings. The second theme comes in after this and is played on the higher end of the vibraphone's range, really embellishing the dreaminess of the track. It's underpinned nicely by a syncopated bass line, utilising some interesting note choices which give it an atonal quality in places. It's also accompanied by a slide guitar made from a Coke can playing a clever counter melody. However, it's the final section which is the standout moment. Building up from the second theme, it accumulates with a call and response interplay between the strings and brass instruments, punctuated with timpani and drum fills which, themselves, act in a kind of percussive counterpoint to one another. The result is nothing short of gorgeous, and not only makes it a standout on an album of standout tracks, but was unlike anything else in popular music in its composition and aesthetic. Moving on to our next song and final cut off of side 1, a reimagining of the Bahamian folk song Sloop John B. While Wilson himself wasn't a fan of folk music, guitarist Al Jardine brought him a revised version of the folk tune with a slightly more interesting and elaborate chord structure. A day later, Brian played Jardine a completely reworked version of the song, which Jardine said blew him away. Curiously, Jardine doesn't get a co-writing, or in this case co-arranging, credit for the track, and Wilson and Love take lead vocal duties on it. Sloop John B is divisive among fans of Pet Sounds. Many people cite it as their favourite cut from the album, lauding its charming and harmonic quality. Others see it as needlessly deviating from the album thematically and atmospherically, an anomaly which has no connection to the other songs on the album lyrically. I actually fall somewhere in the middle with regards to Sloop John B. While it is true that a folk song about a voyage gone wrong doesn't necessarily gel with such an introspective album on the surface, if looked at a little deeper, I find it actually fits more than people give it credit for. The repeated cries of "let me go home, while I feel so broke up I want to go home" mirrored the desire for isolation of "In My Room" and the cries of alienation seen later on the album on "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times" and other songs. Musically, it also fits, as Brian's addition of minor chords and heavy use of both instrumentation and vocal polyphony mean it shares common ground with other tracks on the album. And while I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's the best song off the album, or even one of, say, the top 3, it's still an incredibly smart and well-arranged rendition of an old folk classic, brimming with charm and containing some really wonderful moments. Most notably for me, a wonderful melodic guitar riff which plays throughout the entire track, and a really strong a cappella section that occurs mid-chorus before the final verse, which not only adds to the dynamic of the track, but is probably its standout moment. Side 1 starts with a bang in the form of "Wouldn't It Be Nice," but side 2 starts with "God Only Knows." Frankly, it's not enough to simply call "God Only Knows" the best song on the album, because it's one of the greatest and most beautiful pop songs ever written, on par with anything the Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, or Bob Dylan ever created. Much has been made of the clever use of multiple key signatures, inverted chord progressions, and inspired instrumentation of this song. However, you don't need an extensive knowledge of musical theory to appreciate Wilson's varied and creative use of instrumentation and his ingenious employment of musical dynamics in creating this musical tapestry. Beginning with stabbing chords on both the accordions and the harpsichord, it's the low melody of the French horn that really makes the intro so wonderful. This melody is soon joined by another brilliant melismatic bass line and sleigh bell percussion. The first verse and chorus, both of which blend together seamlessly, being only separated by a subtle change in chord progression, strips the instrumentation down to a tack piano and light percussion, before the second verse throws additional layers at you, most effectively a swell of harmonising violas and cellos, that retain the structural integrity of the previous verse while expanding the track's harmonic scope. An interlude follows, which sees a different motif introduced as well as another polyphonic moment in the vocal section between Brian, Bruce Johnson, and lead singer Carl Wilson. Another round of verses and choruses follow, before an outro based on the chorus sees the song to an end. Before we address the coda though, let's talk about the vocals. In spite of Mike Love's role as frontman and de facto lead singer of the band, and Brian Wilson's signature falsetto, I've always felt that Carl was the most talented singer in the group. Having a stronger timbre and deeper tone than the others, but possessing just as good of a range, Carl's voice had a sweetness to it and, as we would discover in later releases like I Can Hear Music, a soulfulness to it that the other members just didn't have. I think it's interesting that one song Carl took lead vocal duties on, both for my money and by popular consensus, is the standout track on the album and undoubtedly its most beautiful. However, Carl doesn't flaunt his voice here necessarily. He keeps his delivery simple, sticking close to the melody and using no embellishment, which, unsurprisingly, is how he was instructed to sing it by his brother Brian. Don't do anything with it, he was instructed. Just sing it real straight, no effort. We should also take stock here of Wilson and Asher's lyrics. It's common knowledge now that the use of God in the song's title was controversial at the time. However, what's interesting is the dynamic between the author's unrequited love and the fact that the love may be lost, fading, or dead. It begins with the line, "I may not always love you," while other lines in similar vein include, "If you should ever leave me, though life would go on, believe me, the world could show nothing to me, so what good would living do me?" This is so far removed from the simplicity of the "I'll love you forever" or "She broke my heart" lyrical norm of the time. By extension, it also has a much broader range for interpretation of meaning. There is no clear indication whether this was written about a romantic or platonic love. There is also no clear indicator of who the song's subject is. meaning it could be about the early flames of young love or an ode to a dying grandparent. This ambiguity gives it a universal lyrical quality and timelessness that may have been lost in specificity. The amazing thing about God Only Knows is that it doesn't really go through a ton of tonal or structural changes. The key and chord changes are clever but subtle. Once again, it's Wilson's use of dynamics that is the key to the song's genius. The song's outro, A Perpetual Round, is a prime example of this. Taking the line of the chorus, God only knows what I'd be without you, Johnson and the Wilson brothers sing the line over and over again, overlapping one another with impassioned delivery, while a drum kit is introduced, adding a subtle but powerful layer to the outro, and really makes it feel like the entire song was building to this moment. To touch again on the song's lyrics, I personally always felt that this was Brian's ode to his brother Carl, who chose to sing it. And in fact, the structure of the rounds actually make it sound like the three men are singing the line to one another. Plus, given the untimely death of Carl and the fact that the boys still perform it live to this day, it's almost haunting to listen to it now in retrospect. Speaking of the song himself, Carl Wilson had this to say, quote, "The music has a spiritual quality to it. You'd hear all this sound coming out and it did an indescribable thing to the environment." Bruce Johnson summed the track up nice and succinctly too, when he simply stated, "I walked into God Only Knows and I knew something wonderful was going on." While God Only Knows is a less than idealised ode to love, it ultimately resolves on an uplifting and positive note, in spite of the uncertainty of its protagonist. That glimmer of a silver lining would fade, however, as the final notes of the track fade out from the speakers, as almost every remaining song on the album is shrouded in pessimism. The upside, though, is that aside from the aforementioned title track instrumental, they're all excellent in their own way. First up is I Know There's an Answer. Written about Wilson's experience with LSD, it was originally titled Hang On to Your Ego, before Mike Love interjected and changed the lyric to I Know There's an Answer, believing that the reference to the psychedelic was too risque. This is probably for the best too, as just like in God Only Knows, the ambiguity of a song about uptight people living a monotonous existence has a much broader appeal than lyrics specifically dealing with the experience of dropping acid, an experience that many people cannot relate to. It's also worth noting that along with Mike Love, the band's road manager Terry Strachan also gets a co-writing credit on the track. Vocal duties are split between Love, Brian Wilson and Al Jardine, who was criminally underutilised as lead vocalist in the band's discography actually. Answer is one of the finest vocal moments on the whole album. Even though it only features 3 of the boys and sparse backing vocals or harmony, instead Answer stands out by spanning 2 octaves, with the boys going lower in the verses and reaching soaring heights in the chorus. Speaking of the chorus, it's one of the absolute best on the album, if not the best. Preceded by a swelling pre-chorus, it feels like a genuine climax when the full percussion ensemble kicks in, a repeating tactic used in the album to add extra oomph to its choruses. Along with the simple vocal line of I know there's an answer, I know now but I have to find it by myself. The melody on the first eponymous phrase in particular is just simply a fantastic earworm. Again, these moments cannot solely be credited to Wilson's ability to write beautiful melodies. All of the boys had to deliver in their performances during the recording sessions, which were strenuous. Love commented that the vocal sessions were phenomenal but arduous, before quipping that Wilson was like the Stalin of the studio. As busy musically as any other track on the album, I Know There's an Answer is probably best remembered for its use of bass harmonica, not just as decoration but actually as a solo instrument in the interlude before the final pre-chorus. The track's use of woodwinds and bass guitar in the dark, brooding post-chorus breakdowns are also notable, and stick out in what is otherwise one of the livelier tracks on the record. Keeping up with the musical vibrancy while simultaneously dialing up the pessimism, we revisit Here Today, which we mentioned earlier in thematic contrast to I'm Waiting for the Day. Similar to Answer, the song is constantly being propelled forward, with lulls only occurring during the pre-choruses, which we'll touch on in a moment. The verses are driven by some relatively simple organ block chords, some nice trombone and saxophone flourishes, and that now all too familiar percussive attack. The choruses follow a similar trajectory, with the brass instruments featuring more prominently, jumping forward in the mix as they descend downwards. The vocals in this track aren't bad, but are probably among the album's most pedestrian. The best part of this track by far are the understated pre-choruses, providing us with the best vocal melody of the track as Love recites its rawest and most affecting lyrics. She made me feel so bad, she made my heart feel sad, she made my days go wrong. The best moment of the entire song is the final pre-chorus, which is heard without Love's vocals, giving the listener a chance to experience the arrangement without the distraction of the singer. The instrumentation is stripped down to the organ, still playing its block chords, and a walking bass line, which ascends upwards in what is simultaneously one of Pet Sound's most simplistic and most melodically satisfying moments. It's no exaggeration to say that this one moment elevates Here Today from being okay to a very good deep cut. Speaking of deep cuts, next up we have I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Not only is this one of the most remarkable tracks on the album, but it's also the song that best defines the whole record's overarching theme of alienation, both lyrically and atmospherically. The track begins very abruptly, with the signature musical setup of Hammond organ chords and a walking bass line, one of the best ones in the album incidentally, accompanying Brian's reverberating plea for understanding, as he sings the opening line of "I keep looking for a place to fit in where I can speak my mind." The opening gives the listener the impression that they've been thrust into the middle of the song rather than at the beginning, and it is completely devoid of build-up. The track is also home to another beautiful pre-chorus. The other Beach Boys, now together in full force, provide a swelling of ooze underneath some of Brian and Asher's most naked lyricism. Each time things start to happen again, I think I've got something good going for myself with what goes wrong, while the faintest of percussion litters the background with a syncopated, almost arrhythmic pattern. The scattered nature of the pre-chorus is symptomatic of one of the song's most notable traits, and that's that it all feels a little bit disjointed. Now this will be a negative quality in most pop songs, but in the hands of an elite composer like Wilson, it doesn't only work, but ends up being one of its most redeemable qualities. The song goes through 5 distinct musical motifs prior to the second verse that repeat twice. After the verse, which we've already discussed, the next section, which for the sake of the video we'll call verse B, sees an elevation both vocally and musically while maintaining the melancholy, before dropping back down to the aforementioned pre-chorus, before being brought back up again for the loudest section in the song, which we'll call pre-chorus B, led by pounding drums and polyphonic vocals. The chorus is led by a tenor sax and containing only one line, the semi-eponymous "I guess I just wasn't made for these times," and bookended by the same percussion riff that teeters underneath the pre-choruses, accompanied by the drone of saxophones and Wilson's dying vocal line. By the time we've experienced 2 rounds of this, less than 2.5 minutes have passed, and it's amazing to think that so many musical themes and twists and turns have been crammed in such a short period of time. And although it's hard to know if this was done purposely or subconsciously, it's neat how the musical structure mirrors the lyrics. Every time I get the inspiration to go change things around, no one wants to help me look for places where new things might be found, and they say I've got brains but they ain't doing me no good. Wilson was an island of a man, marooned by his genius and ambition. Ruminating about where his head was at the time, Wilson said, "I had it in my head that I was a misfit, that I didn't fit in with society." Pet Sounds debuted at number 106 on the US Billboard charts, before eventually peaking at number 10. A commercial failure by the group's standards, and it divided critics and fans down the middle. It would take years for the musical achievement that is Pet Sounds to be fully appreciated and receive the universal acclaim it deserves, meaning that Wilson's assertion that he wasn't made for the times in which he lived had, at least musically, more than a grain of truth to it. However, just when you've digested the musical rollercoaster and depressing lyricism of "I just wasn't made for these times," it takes another turn. Not to be outdone by the bass harmonica solo in Answer, the first prominent use of the theremin takes us through a solo rendition of the verse melody. Accompanied and beautifully harmonised initially by the saxophone section, it tapers off in a blur of vibrato barely 15 seconds after it starts, and leaves the listener with an enhanced version of the chorus, complete with backing vocals and modulations out of nowhere, that leaves the listener reeling. This slice of eclectic musical excellence is followed by the self-titled instrumental which, again, isn't terrible but fails to make an impact on the record the magnitude of its namesake. Funnily enough, it resembles musically the group's earlier work more than any other track on the album, with its Dick Dale-inspired guitar melody conjuring up images of crashing waves and mojitos more than barnyard animals. Finally, the album ends with its most depressing track, Caroline No, punctuating the tonal and lyrical shift from side 1 to side 2 with an almost funeral march closer. Much has been made of this track. It was the lead single from the record and has been praised and analysed ad nauseum. And while I personally feel like there are much better songs on the album than this, it is a fine composition. I especially like the solo woodwind section and the unnerving vibraphone that is sprinkled throughout the outro. It's just that for me, Caroline No isn't quite as vital as some people believe it to be, at least when compared to some of the album's stronger cuts. Still though, I like the fact that Wilson chose to end the album with this song. Rather than resolve the protagonist's slide into depression and loneliness at the album's conclusion, Wilson simply left him and the listeners in that psychological obscurity, which is where Wilson was at the time. A state of mind that would deteriorate and get worse for many years before it would get better. Lyrically, the protagonist describes a changed woman he has lost love and faith in. Where did your long hair go? Where is the girl I used to know? You used to say you'd never change, but that's not true. Ending every other phrase with the tired and depressive cry of, "Oh Caroline, no." This is not the wishful thinking of wouldn't it be nice, the yearning of I'm waiting for the day, or even the jaded pessimism of here today. This is complete loss of love and hope. This is Wilson finally floating out into a sea of loneliness all by himself as the music fades out. So while musically there may have been a more appropriate swan song for Pet Sounds, thematically and for the composer personally, it is the perfect coda to one of the greatest, if not the greatest, albums of all time. Pet Sounds would be released on May 16th, 1966. As I said, it would divide critics, particularly in America, with some hating the departure from the band's previous surf rock sound, and some lauding it as a revolution in popular music. Just as Rubber Soul inspired Brian to write Pet Sounds, his masterpiece in turn stoked the flames of the creative rivalry between himself and the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. Bruce Johnson recalls a time when he was in England and he got a visit from the two Beatles, saying, "Lennon and McCartney showed up at my hotel room and we played Pet Sounds all night long and they were just mesmerised." So mesmerised were they by what they heard that Pet Sounds would, at least in part, drive the Beatles to write and record one of their best albums, and undoubtedly their most iconic, in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which came out the following year in 1967. Wilson would attempt to volley back that same year, but the creative pressure and his rapidly declining mental state meant that 1967's Smiley Smile was an underwhelming album which saw Wilson crushed under the pressure of the competition and his own creative ambition. This time was, in many ways, the absolute peak of creativity in 1960s popular music, and maybe even ever. The Beatles would break up 3 years later, and the Beach Boys' name would be bandied about in a variety of different incarnations, often without Wilson, its primary creative force, at the helm. That being said, the history of the Beach Boys' pre- and post-Pet Sounds is lengthy and complex, and a topic for an entirely separate video. So in conclusion, what makes Pet Sounds a classic album? To reiterate a point I made at the very beginning of the video, Pet Sounds is simply a phenomenal record that is greater than the sum of its numerous intricate parts. Pet Sounds is an outstanding collection of songs first and foremost, regardless of all the bells and whistles present. To put it another way, an ensemble of over 50 musicians, complex arrangements, and unprecedented studio time and budget does not a great album make. Over the past 50 years, there have been countless examples of bands entering the studio with money to burn and time to kill, only to emerge with a collection of long, progressive songs or broad concepts which miss the mark completely in spite of, or even because of, the ambitious intent. No symphony orchestra or sought-after producer or engineering wizard is going to make a collection of mediocre songs great, regardless of how much they clean it up in the studio. Pet Sounds is as great as it is because of all its components. The production, engineering, the string sections, and the wrecking crew are all as integral to the songs in which they feature as the Beach Boys' vocals, Wilson's songwriting, and his and Asher's lyricism. The symbiotic relationship between its parts, combined with the atmospheric reverb and the consistent thematic continuity, make Pet Sounds one of the most musically ambitious and complex pop albums ever made, one of the most haunting and introspective albums ever made, one of the most cohesive albums of all time, and, most important of all, one of, if not the greatest album ever made.